Carl Gustav Jung stood alone by the darkened Zürichsee in the winter of 1913 and felt the first tremor of something vast cracking beneath his feet. The world called him doctor, thinker, rising star of psychoanalysis, but the title that mattered most to Jung, that brittle crown of rational mastery, was beginning to splinter. For months he had been hounded by waking visions, a monstrous flood engulfing Europe, frozen lands littered with corpses, seas of blood where culture itself seemed to drown. The world, as it would prove in 1914, was indeed primed for war. But Jung understood these images were not mere political forecasts. They were, he realized in terror, the voice of the unconscious speaking with apocalyptic force. And it was not whispering, it was demanding audience. To meet that demand, Jung did something few physicians, few scientists, few comfortable men of letters would dare. He deliberately relinquished the veneer of sanity. He invited the stream of images to swell, permitted the nightmarish figures to sit at his breakfast table, and began transcribing everything, word for word, picture for picture, into an oversized crimson journal that would one day be called the Red Book. Those who later read it saw a mythic pilgrimage between opposites, heaven and hell, masculine and feminine, spirit and instinct. They saw Jung converse with prophets, serpents, demon gods, and a winged figure named Philemon who spoke like an ancient sage. But buried in the Red Book's aftermath lies a subtler, more clinical record, the paper he drafted in 1916, The Structure of the Unconscious, and the expanded 1928 volume, The Relations Between the I and the Unconscious. These works provide the skeleton key to that crimson labyrinth. In them, Jung unveils a concept that would split his own ego down the middle and redefine depth psychology, the mana personality. Mana in Polynesian lore is a charged spiritual potency, power that can heal crops or level villages, a neutral force magnified by whoever wields it. Jung repurposed the word to describe the psychological phenomenon that emerges when a person's unconscious contents flood consciousness and temporarily seize the ego's throne. It feels like being inhabited by a superhuman voice, a prophet, a magician, a saint, perhaps even a god. Most men brush such episodes aside as delusions. Jung did not. He recognized them as archetypal energy, rich, numinous, deeply dangerous. During the early Red Book years, Jung himself was visited by exactly this eruption. The intellect that once collaborated with Freud now bowed before something wiser, stranger, looming out of dream. That entity, part guardian, part devourer, became what he later labeled the mana personality. Listen to Jung's own confession from the 1916 paper. When the shadow is recognized, the confrontation with the inert unconscious begins. At such moments, the individual is seized by a psychic agency possessing superior insight and power. In tribal language, we would say he is overpowered by mana. Notice the verb, overpowered. The ego does not negotiate, it submits. Suddenly the ordinary I stumbles into a cathedral inside the skull, and a robed stranger lights the altar. The impulse is to kneel. For years, Jung had worshipped the Enlightenment ideal of reason. He believed, as Freud did, that intellectual daylight was the cure for psychic disease. The mana event shattered that optimism. Here was a revelation no Cartesian lamp could banish. The human mind is not a civilized apartment, but a wild kingdom whose true rulers dwell below. From this crisis, Jung extracted a principle. The ego is provisional. It is an adaptive tool, not the sovereign self. The unconscious is autonomous. It generates ideas, moods, even life-altering commands without consulting the ego. When the ego touches the autonomous unconscious without preparation, it risks inflation or collapse. Inflation happens when the ego fuses with the mana energy and believes, I am chosen. Collapse occurs when the ego is crushed under the immensity of that same force, whispering, I am nothing. Jung experienced both poles in rapid succession. One day he would pace his study feeling like a prophet of cosmic renewal. The next, he would doubt his sanity, terrified he might succumb to psychosis like Nietzsche before him. Yet through that crucible, a deeper third option emerged, integration. Instead of clinging to rational control or surrendering to archetypal possession, Jung sought a middle way. The ego must learn to relate to the unconscious as a dialogical partner, not a god to worship, not a demon to exile, but a profound other whose symbols educate the soul. That middle way became the core of his 1928 volume, The Transcendent Function, a bridge principle uniting conscious and unconscious into a living, creative tension. But in 1916, the shock was still raw. The entity had broken him wide open. The monopersonality was real, and it demanded respect. The monopersonality isn't simply a strange mood or burst of inspiration. It is the unconscious wearing a crown, an archetype masquerading as you. And the most terrifying thing, you won't realize it's happening. To Jung, archetypes were psychic organs, timeless patterns of behavior, myth, and instinct buried in the collective unconscious. When these archetypes awaken, they do not knock politely. They flood consciousness with visions, convictions, and divine authority. The monopersonality is what happens when one of these archetypes, most often the wise old man, the magician, or the inner prophet, hijacks the ego. And it feels magnificent. Jung describes it this way: the moment you become aware of the self, that is, of the unconscious totality of your psyche, the ego is dethroned. A personality enters which is wiser, older, more complete. You feel yourself to be merely its instrument. It can start with a vision, a dream, a voice that whispers truths too profound to explain. You begin to feel chosen, destined. You speak with new authority, not because you studied, but because something now speaks through you. To the world, it looks like genius. To Jung, it was possession. Jung called this phenomenon inflation, the swelling of the ego with unconscious energy. A person caught in inflation becomes increasingly certain, increasingly symbolic, increasingly dangerous. They mistake archetypal insight for personal brilliance. They wear the mask of the shaman, but lose the human beneath it. In Jung's time, this spiritual inflation was often romanticized. Mystics, poets, even politicians wrapped themselves in the cloak of higher destiny. Jung saw through the glamour. In the relations between the I and the unconscious, he writes, "An inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about the future." In other words, the monopersonality disables humility. It turns wisdom into weaponry, and it seduces the ego into thinking it is the voice of God. Jung saw this archetypal possession all around him. In the rise of fascist leaders who believed they embodied the will of the people. In spiritual gurus who demanded total loyalty while preaching transcendence. In revolutionary thinkers whose ideas were pure fire, but who crumbled in personal relationships. He even saw it in himself. In a dream recorded in the Red Book, Jung finds himself at the foot of a huge black serpent. The serpent transforms into a beautiful woman, who then becomes a divine figure of wisdom. But when Jung bows to her, she warns, "Woe betide those who live by the Spirit. They become children of the devil." Jung understood. Even spiritual light casts a shadow, especially when you think it doesn't. So what do you do when the monopersonality arises? Do you banish it? Exorcise it? No. Jung's answer was harder. You dialogue with it. You neither merge with it nor reject it. You sit in the tension. This was the birth of Jung's concept of individuation, not becoming perfect, but becoming whole. The monopersonality is not the enemy. It is a fragment of the self, the deeper, total you, rising to the surface. But it is still just a part. And this is where most people fail. They experience a vision, a moment of divine insight, and assume they've reached enlightenment. They stop growing. They start preaching. They stop listening. Jung writes, "He who identifies with the monopersonality becomes a sort of shaman or guru, but he who relates to it, who integrates it, gains true insight. He becomes a bridge between the conscious and unconscious worlds." This is the subtle path of the inner alchemist. You receive the vision, but return to the village. You accept the archetype, but remain human. You let the prophet speak, but still make coffee, pay taxes, and listen to your children. The monopersonality wants to become your face. individuation means giving it a seat at the table but never the throne. Jung's genius wasn't that he had visions. Many have visions. His genius was that he didn't drown in them. He transcribed the Red Book, drew the mandalas, conversed with Philemon and Elijah and Salome, but he never claimed to be a prophet. He remained a psychologist, a student of the psyche. He allowed the images to rise, but structured them through analysis. He let the chaos speak, but translated it into a new psychological language. This is why Jung survived what broke others. Nietzsche heard the same voices, but believed he was Zarathustra. Blake painted the same divine worlds, but was considered mad. Jung, he walked the line. He wrote in his journal, "I am not these figures. They are parts of me, and I must learn from them without becoming them." That's the lesson we take forward. The monopersonality is part of you, a glorious, terrifying part, but it is not the whole. If you surrender, you become possessed. If you resist, you become blind. But if you relate, consciously, humbly, courageously, you begin to awaken. The world has always been enchanted by figures who seem to glow with an otherworldly presence. The charismatic leader, the prophetic poet, the revolutionary with a distant gaze and the weight of destiny in his voice. These are modern incarnations of what Jung identified as the mana personality. From ancient shamans to 20th century dictators, this archetype has walked through every corridor of power, cloaked in mystery and dripping with spiritual certainty. The world listens, follows, and often obeys such figures without question, because they do not speak as men, but as if they channel something far greater, something eternal, something divine. Jung warned that this power was not always destructive, but it was always dangerous. When the monopersonality emerges in the psyche, it carries the authority of the deep unconscious. The ego, unprepared and dazzled, may fall to its knees. The result is not always immediate madness, it may be slow, seductive possession. One begins to speak not as oneself, but with the voice of something larger. Advice becomes prophecy. Thought becomes decree. Doubt disappears. The psychological humility that once tempered action now melts away. And that is the moment when the human being becomes an instrument. Whether for healing or destruction, the archetype has taken the wheel. Jung lived through this seduction during his deep inner confrontation in the years following his break with Freud. The Red Book was not a book he wrote. It was a book he transcribed from visions, dreams, and dialogues with archetypal figures that erupted from within him. Philemon, his inner guide, appeared as a wise old man with wings and the gaze of eternity. Jung admitted that what Philemon told him often felt more intelligent than anything he himself could consciously produce. Yet he resisted the temptation to identify with Philemon. He did not declare himself a prophet. He did not start a new religion. He wrote instead, "Philemon is a force within me, but not me." That act of separation was heroic, because Jung knew to merge with the monopersonality is to dissolve into the archetype, to become the vessel of the self, but lose the self in the process. It is the psychological equivalent of being consumed by fire. You may speak like a god, but you forget you are still a man. The modern world is filled with figures who failed to draw this line. Political leaders whose sense of divine mission made them immune to criticism. Cult founders who believed they alone channeled universal truth. Social media prophets who trade nuance for revelation, complexity for certainty, and dialogue for dogma. Jung understood that these were not just egomaniacs. They were spiritually inflated individuals possessed by the archetype of the wise one, the redeemer, or the savior. In their minds, they had become the voice of truth itself. This dynamic is as old as mythology. In Egypt, the pharaoh was both king and god. In Rome, the emperor became divine in death. In Christianity, Christ is God made man. But Jung's insight was not theological. It was psychological. The human psyche has within it a built-in vulnerability to its own archetypes. We long to become something larger than ourselves. We crave transcendence. We ache to be meaningful. And when that archetypal energy rises, we may surrender gladly, mistaking possession for purpose. But the true task, Jung argued, was not to become the archetype. It was to relate to it. The ego must remain grounded even as it dialogues with the divine. One must learn to walk through visions with both reverence and restraint. You must bow before the storm, but still keep your boots on the ground. To become conscious of the monopersonality is to realize that the power you feel is not personal, it is impersonal. It belongs to the collective unconscious. You are merely a vessel. And if you forget that, you risk becoming a tyrant in your own psyche. In The Relations Between the I and the Unconscious, Jung explains that every contact with the unconscious creates a new possibility, either deeper consciousness or deeper illusion. It all depends on whether the ego can integrate what arises. If it can, the result is wisdom. If it cannot, the result is madness. That is why individuation is not just a mystical process, it is a moral one. It demands honesty, courage, self-observation, the ability to say, "This is not me, but it is within me." The irony is profound. The more unconscious power you integrate, the humbler you must become. Not because you are weak, but because the weight of the self is so immense, only a conscious ego can bear it, and most cannot. Jung saw his own near collapse. There were days he questioned his sanity, feared that the visions in the Red Book would consume him. But rather than flee or preach, he carved them into symbols. He drew mandalas. He wrote psychological theories. He transformed fire into structure. That is the alchemical process, not turning base metal into gold, but turning raw inner chaos into meaning. So when Jung speaks of the monopersonality, he is not condemning it. He is warning us. He is offering a blueprint for how to meet the archetypal self without losing your soul. The monopersonality is not evil. It is sacred energy in raw form. But to carry it without being crushed, you must be forged. You must become someone who does not speak as if they know the truth, but as someone who has stood in its presence, trembled, and returned. There is a reason so many of the world's mystics, saints, and sages end their lives in silence. They saw too much. They touched something beyond, and they realized no words could fully contain it. Jung, too, grew quieter over time, less definitive, more symbolic, because the deeper you go, the more you realize that the true self is not something you can explain. It is something you must live. That's why the monopersonality broke him, but also refined him. It was not destruction, it was a sacred fracture, a splitting open of the known to allow something greater to emerge. Not as dogma, but as dialogue. And if we are to follow Jung, not worship him, but walk beside him, we must carry the same burden. We must face the monopersonality within ourselves. We must question our spiritual certainty, our moral superiority, our intellectual pride. We must ask, is this me speaking? Or is something ancient speaking through me? And once we ask that, we begin to wake up. When the monopersonality appears, it feels like revelation. But Jung's deepest realization was not how to embrace it, it was how to survive it. And to survive it, one must return. Return to what? To ordinariness, to limitation, to suffering, to the strange and painful fact of being human. This return is not failure, it is the triumph, because the archetypes do not want you to live among them forever. The gods may visit, but they do not stay. The self may erupt through your dreams, may speak through visions, may burn through your body like lightning, but it does not want to replace you. It wants you to grow. Jung learned that possession by the monopersonality is a stage, not an endpoint. It is what he called the inflation before integration. It is the moment you confuse insight for arrival, but the truth is harsher. The deeper the vision, the greater the need to come back down. We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. The monopersonality is a figure of light, but it casts a long shadow, and if you cannot see that shadow, you are not yet conscious. You are still possessed. So how do we come back down? We accept our wounds. We re-enter our relationships. We humble ourselves before the ordinary worlds we once thought we had transcended. We stop trying to be the wise one, and instead, listen to him. We let Philemon speak, but we do not put on his robes. This is the painful truth Jung discovered. The monopersonality is a mask worn by the self, but it is not the self. And the self is not you. It is the source from which you come, the totality that your ego is only beginning to explore. Your job is not to become God. Your job is to relate to God, within. In the Red Book, Jung describes a moment of utter breakdown. The visions have overwhelmed him. The archetypes crowd around. Philemon, Elijah, Salome. They speak in riddles and terrifying symbols. Jung becomes the observer, the recorder, the student, but his ego cracks. He writes, "I was hanging on the cross. I was he who hung there. He looked at me with infinite compassion, and I knew I was not him." This line is critical. He was not the Savior. He was the crucified, the shattered man, the one who bled under the weight of meaning he could not yet carry. And this was his rebirth. Because the moment you realize you are not the archetype, you are free. The moment you see that your prophetic voice is also your psychological wound, you are healing. The moment you see that your visions are both true and dangerous, you become wise. In that moment, the monopersonality no longer possesses you. It becomes integrated. The wise one becomes your guide, not your mask. The magician becomes your teacher, not your identity. And the self becomes the source, not the self. This is the completion of the alchemical process, conscious union with the unconscious without being consumed by it. It is why Jung insisted the spiritual journey was not up into the heavens, but down into the soul's depths, into the mud, the pain, the contradictions, the wounds. Because only there, in the crucible of shadow and chaos, do you find the true self. And the true self doesn't shout, it whispers. We now live in a world Jung could only glimpse, but he would recognize the symptoms immediately. A culture overflowing with ungrounded inspiration, shallow gurus, spiritual bypassing, false prophets, and ego dressed in transcendence. The monopersonality is now a brand. Social media turns archetypes into influencers. The voice of certainty is rewarded. The one who speaks as if they know is heard above the one who questions. And in this climate, the monopersonality thrives, not in the deep mystical sense Jung meant, but as performance. But don't be fooled. The deeper danger is still there. People are still being possessed, not by demons, but by unconscious energy, by collective archetypes that they mistake for personal destiny. And the result is emotional chaos, manic spiritual highs, crushing depressions, identity confusion, narcissism disguised as insight, and communities that follow charisma instead of truth. Jung warned us, every step toward greater consciousness is a kind of Promethean crime, something stolen from the gods. If you take that fire, you must know how to carry it, or you burn yourself, and others. So what do we do with all this? We listen. We learn to tell the difference between a real voice and a seductive one. We ask, does this insight make me more connected, more compassionate, more human? Or does it isolate me, elevate me, inflate me? We surround ourselves with people who challenge us, not flatter us. We make art, we write, we speak, but we hold every word with humility. And when the monopersonality appears in our dreams, we bow, but we do not kneel forever. We ask, what are you here to teach me? What part of myself have I forgotten? What truth must I live, not proclaim? Because the final goal is not glory, not enlightenment, not to be revered. The final goal, for Jung, was integration. And integration is humble, quiet, invisible. It does not make you a master, it makes you real. So why call it the entity that broke Carl Jung? Because it did. It tore through his life like a storm. It left him trembling, weeping, drawing symbols he did not understand. It forced him to question reality, to abandon the safety of Freud, to walk into the madness of myth. But it also built him. It refined him. It taught him how to live with the fire of the self without being consumed by it. And that is what makes Jung's legacy not just brilliant, but trustworthy. He did not preach from above. He shared from within. He showed us that the deepest spiritual truths are also the most dangerous, and that only those willing to be broken by them can ever carry them forward. So when the monopersonality comes to you, and it will, be ready. Bow, but don't worship. Listen, but don't merge. Learn, but stay grounded. And most importantly, become the vessel, not the god. That is the path Jung left us, not an escape from the self, but a descent into it. A confrontation with the archetype, a union with a shadow, a dance with the fire that leaves you not inflated, but whole.